Welcome to the Progress Texas Happy Hour.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. Podcasting director Chris Mosier here. As we know, Venezuela has been part of the rapid-fire news sequence that comes at us with rapid-fire sort of succession over the last little while, but the Venezuela situation is definitely one with which we will be contending for a little while, it would appear, especially when it comes to energy. And so for this talk, we've brought in a couple of guys whose company I rather enjoy, first of all, and second of all, a couple of guys who really know the ins and outs of the oil industry. Let's start with Jon Rosenthal, state representative out of the Houston area and current candidate for the Texas Railroad Commission. Hey, Jon, how are you?
I'm well. Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. And Bill Burch, whom we met a couple of years ago in a similar capacity. He was running for the Railroad Commission back during the 2024 cycle, has become kind of a go-to dude that we go to as much as we possibly can on matters of the Texas petroleum sector. And so, Bill Burch, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be back on.
Absolutely. So I want to get you guys' take, and we're so early on this, and it's almost one of those topics that's difficult to discuss because it's moving so fast and things are going to, it could all change on a dime. And so let's get this out while we can. I want to start with Bill here. And of course, Jon, you weigh in afterwards. President Trump has stated that U.S. oil companies are going to be in the lead of the multi-billion-dollar effort to fix Venezuela's oil infrastructure. We've seen some degree of pushback and hesitance coming from oil executives that have been engaged in this conversation. Bill, starting with you, and this is very much your specialty. You're a hardware guy for sure. Given the state of decay that we're told that the Venezuelan oil fields are in, is it realistic to expect Texas-based oil companies, service companies to jump on this? And what would you say are the main technical hurdles should they engage in getting Venezuelan oil up to where it would be a reasonable thing to do?
That's a great question. So the oil and gas industry has a lot of hesitation and a lot of heartburn about jumping into Venezuela because of the infrastructure. In the late 90s, there was still a handful of folks working, maintaining the systems, and the 2019 pullout was pretty extreme. When Conoco and everybody pretty much lost their operating licenses, the status of equipment over the last 6 years has literally been fully neglected. Oilfield theft is common. Sabotaging the valves, the failures of the plumbing. There was a blowout during COVID where a well in Maracaibo let go, put oil everywhere for about 6 weeks. There was no ability to respond to it. The overall structure of the infrastructure in Venezuela is literally ground zero, having to be rebuilt.
Wow.
To modern standards. And the driver of this is that the early estimates were, I think they were quoted something like $7 to $10 billion for infrastructure investment. And the later numbers now coming out are like $60 to $80 billion of investment. And then when Trump said that the oil companies would have $100 billion of basically investment guarantees, that they would get their ROI, the number is closer to $150 to $200 billion now, I've heard, in terms of capital infrastructure required. And it's everything. It's from the wells in the ground, the pipeline, remediation of the old systems, the refining capacity to get it to port, to get it loaded out. The whole entire system has to be basically stripped down and rebuilt. That's not a simple, cheap, and easy fix.
Right.
And if anybody's looking at the analogous scenario of Iraq, at least Iraq had working infrastructure and a port in the Persian Gulf that was manageable to a degree, just to load out oil and get things structurally sound. Venezuela is not like the Iraq scenario. This is a completely different capital investment, and hence Exxon's legitimacy of Darren Wood's pushback about we're not overly thrilled about jumping back into Venezuela. Yes, it's a $100 billion project and it's a major source of hydrocarbon, but they're not actively going to the board of directors saying, yeah, let's approve this capital expenditure. This is something that's it's a big risk, and it's not a guaranteed return unless we're going to put American military on the ground, literally guaranteeing supply infrastructure support, which I have a lot of heartburn about using the U.S. military for ferrying and transfer services.
For sure, for sure. Jon, tell us what you see as the kind of ground zero or the starting gate for this whole thing.
I pretty much agree with what Bill is just saying. And I would add on top of that, it's not just that the hands-on, like mechanical, the infrastructure part of it, but it's also the political climate. So while they took out the top piece, the regime is still there. And so you have to add to the risk profile the notion, the possibility that they could go down there and spend a bunch of money getting stuff working again, and just to be kicked out, forcefully again, like fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me sort of thing. And so the risk profile for this endeavor is huge. And just on top of that, where the price of oil is just a little under $60 a barrel right now, which is a little better than break even in the best of circumstances when you're doing, cheap shale work, here. But if you're going to go down there and spend a bunch of money before product even starts moving, the risk is just enormous. And so it's a treacherous path to walk. And I would understand companies having big hesitancy behind that.
I'll throw in one other on the ground argument. I had several friends that worked in Venezuela up to as late as 2019 when they were finally evacuated out of El Tigre and Maracaibo. And they were talking about the fact that when they came in on the chopper service from Caracas to the field, that they couldn't carry any U.S. dollars. There was legitimacy of hostage concerns. The compounds were completely being literally incarcerated on the compounds within the facilities. They had full military escort to move from the compound to the drilling locations. This is not going to change that scenario. The Venezuelans are still poor. The infrastructure is extraordinarily broken internally in the country. You're still going to have a high risk of kidnapping and corruption schemes and people trying to find a way to make a buck. You're going to have these real high security risk concerns, which come at a premium cost for contractors. So if I'm bidding this out, if I'm Kellogg Brown, KBR, or if I'm one of the other major contractors, I am not working in Bechtel. I'm not walking into this saying I'm giving you a U.S. pricing structure. This is coming at a 1.6, 1.8 multiple on my contracting because I know I've got high risk suing into this, and I'm going to need a Blackwater or a Triple Canopy or various military contractors support services for my own group, not just the U.S. military as well. So this is not going to be a low-cost implementation to get Venezuelan crude easily flowing to the ports, and everybody says, "Yay, we're making money." This is not simple.
It starts as a gigantic mess, it would appear. The second question, starting with you, Jon, on this one, currently running for the Texas Railroad Commission. You've talked a lot about accountability. The Trump administration is trying to frame this as part of an overall U.S. energy dominance sort of agenda. Talk about how we would possibly balance the situation with a potential benefit to Texas refineries, which of course are set up to handle the heavy crude that comes out of Venezuela, against the potential glut that could lower prices and hurt the profit margins of oil producers as they stand right now. You mentioned the price is not in a super advantageous place for there to be this giant investment in making more oil come out of the ground. Talk about that. How does that balance out with the world market and for Texas in particular?
Well, it's a good question. First, if you get to the point where you're producing product cheaply,
right,
enough to shake markets, I think the real concern over destabilizing global energy markets isn't over the quantity of oil or product, because that's a ways off in the future if they even pursue it, but just the sort of political power structure destabilization makes everything riskier as far as, our refining capacity and the products that we need to make the stuff that we make. Most of that heavy and sour crude that we get right now comes from like Mexico and Canada. Right. It's not like we don't have what we need to do it. And so if you actually got to the point where you are flooding the market with cheap product, that would be really, frankly, disastrous for West Texas working families and stuff. But it's at this point, it's hand waving. We're not talking about any real sort of scenario in the immediate future at all. Like that, we were just talking about the risk profile and the huge investment that would have to happen. And then it takes literally years to build those. Like, I don't know if you can rebuild them any faster than you would just make new installations, At some point you just scrap the stuff and start over. So I don't know where it is, but it's easily 6 to 10 years to see serious production if they choose to make that investment.
Well, I agree. John's point is spot on. This is not a short cycle turnaround. This is not an immediate impact. It will add more supply, but I would counter the supply argument with we're now screwing around with Iran. There's still Libya that's still trying to stabilize from the Gaddafi regime. Two major OPEC players that are, part of the triumvirate of OPEC players that are currently not really producing to the open market. Iran crude certainly could hit the open market a lot faster and easier to refine than the Venezuelan margins. The Venezuelan margin really is for us. It really is for the Gulf Coast. It's for the Baytown refineries that are really set up for the heavy crude distillation.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is a little bit of we don't really need it. We had adequate supply. We're getting supply from Canada. Now, granted, the Keystone Pipeline was supposed to bring in a lot more of it, and a lot more of the refining capacity was supposed to have been done, but we didn't get the pipeline capacity to get the heavy crude to the Gulf. But again, the Venezuelan crude isn't necessarily a major input to we're not short on the supply side of it. And it's not that simple either because of the sulfur content. That's one of the things that people have a tendency to forget is that this has got a very high sulfur content crude that does have more technical complexity. And the major user of sulfur-based bitumen and low-end product is the marine industry. And the marine industry passed several years ago the legislation that you can't use the high sulfur content diesel in the marine vessels anymore. So the entire global marine fleet went to a low sulfur content diesel to burn for the marine vessels. There isn't a huge market for high sulfur content crude. So we're kind of in a spot of I don't quite get the White House logic on what we're gaining short term, maybe long term stabilization of supply for heavy ends, but it's a bit of a reach.
It appears that Trump made a really broad assumption about how excited he thought the oil companies were going to be about the prospect of getting their hands on Venezuela. They don't seem to be super interested for a lot of the reasons that you guys have already, taken a really good deep dive on, and we appreciate that very much. I'm curious about, Bill's coming to us from Odessa right now. I'm pretty sure. Didn't you say, Bill, you're in Odessa?
I am. I'm actually out here in West Texas.
Right. And John, of course, has been traveling the state on his campaign for Railroad Commission, talking to a whole bunch of different folks. I'm curious, starting with you, John, here again, because you've been out there shaking hands. Is there any feedback that you've gotten from any of the people that you're meeting out there, either from a political standpoint or from an energy sector sort of standpoint on all this stuff that we're talking about? Are you hearing any feedback, either positive or negative, about the situation in Venezuela from people who would kind of know what they're talking about, people who are involved directly in oil or their families?
So it's a good question. When you go out on a campaign trail, and especially at this early stage, and I will say I'm unopposed, so I'm your Democratic nominee for
That's right,
road commissioner.
Good job.
Which is a good feat all by itself, right? And we could talk about that later. But
there was some intrigue in that, and we'll talk about that maybe. And Bill will want to maybe weigh in on that too.
Yeah, actually, I want to shout out to Bill and be super thankful for helping us with a heads up on that whole situation, because sadly he was blindsided by a fake candidate and got totally jacked over by that situation. And really, because of that, we at least had the forewarning to tackle that head on.
Right. Let's go ahead and describe what we're talking about for people who who are not up. Let's not put it off for later.
Baseball conversation, right?
A little bit. If you're not following, the nominee last time around for Texas Railroad Commission was a young lady by the name of Catherine Colbert, who got the nomination over Bill. I do want to point out at this point that Progress Texas, that we endorsed Bill Burch for that particular run back then. So I think we can look back with a little bit of "I told you so" for sure, and even more so now, because Catherine Colbert famously, or to some of us, to political nerds, campaigned amongst Democratic fundraising circles for her run for Texas Railroad Commission, which is actually continuing. However, on filing day, she filed as a Republican. which was something that Bill talked about in our prior conversations, that his suspicion was that she was a bit of a fake Democrat, shall we say. And it turns out to have very much been the case. Let's not spend too much time bagging on Catherine necessarily. We know the story, but your impressions of all that. Let's go back to Jon for what you guys learned.
Right. So the question was, are people, out there in society talking about the
Right.
Venezuela situation? They're not talking about it in the kind of actual real world terms that we're having a conversation here.
Yeah.
Most folks, at least at this early stage, not having a primary and circulating among Democrat clubs, it's more of a political conversation.
Right.
And so people are critical of, what appears to be somewhere between a catastrophic error and just a bold dumbass move, right? If anything, it's gonna help us, I think, because as this plays out and people become aware of what a useless act this was, and boldly, false pretense or whatever, I think it helps us politically. But even people who are in and around the industry aren't talking about it much, because the people that I know that do the work, either serving the industry or in the industry overall, are not looking at like licking their chops at having big contracts or anything, because nothing is happening and no one thinks there's a possibility of that anytime soon. So it just does not change real life, real world for most of us that are around this energy industry.
Yeah, 100% agree with Jon. There's zero impact on equipment, supplies, logistics. There's nobody looking at allocating resources. The oil companies may have the drilling plans and have the lease agreements and mineral rights contracts, but the reality of the service providers, nobody is licking their chops at, oh wow, how can we start to plan on moving drilling rigs and pipe and getting staff put into Venezuela? In fact, if anything, they're actually trying to figure out what do we have remaining that's still intact and contacts left in country that aren't part of the Maduro regime that we could trust or could work. Because again, it was 2019, it's only 6 years ago. Halliburton and a lot of others still had functioning contracts in Venezuela. Halliburton, now being no longer a Houston-based company, but being a Dubai-based company, had active service contracts in Venezuela that weren't against the embargoes or against the sanctions. And again, Chevron was the only remaining operator who had still active licenses and somehow skirted around the fiduciary requirements of not having corruption practices. But even then, they pulled all of their U.S.-based personnel out of Venezuela in 2019. So even for somebody who's still active like a Chevron, they're not actively looking at how we can move drilling, engineering support, and production support teams into Venezuela, besides who's already on staff in Venezuela currently, who are mostly Venezuelan nationals. There is nothing currently being looked at in the industry that's going to affect Texas in the short-term window. And Jon's 100% correct. It's all political maneuvering at this point for the vast majority of the conversations.
Well, to the politics of it all, Jon, and back to you now with your Democratic nominee hat on. Talk about what's the nature of the interaction between this entire situation that we've been talking about and the Texas Railroad Commission. Is there a specific political or governmental sort of angle that's on your mind with the prospect of being part of that commission?
Yeah, it's a good question. So all of my campaigns, I've kind of preached a message of common sense and steady level, thoughtful governance. And so this is a perfect backdrop to contrast with that, because it's anything but. The dude literally went and invaded a country to take their oil and had not talked to the people that do oil stuff. I mean,
I hate to laugh because it has the potential to be a horrible situation, but there's a comical level to all of this.
Anyone that's done any real world work, and if you're trying to take on large projects, you know that the biggest part of that is before you act, you have to build some consensus.
Right.
If you've got some key players from different areas, if you don't have those people on board, your stuff is not going to happen. It's not going to work. And so the message that I'll just continue preaching is doing the stuff that we want to do for Texas working families, for our industry, and for our energy production picture in this state. If you want to address, the your electric bills keep getting higher, and people are worried about having enough energy to power the population and the new industry moving in here, then we need to actually do stuff that makes sense and be thoughtful about that. Grow our industry while we grow every type of energy production and encourage the development of new technologies and all that kind of jazz. I mean, that's the sort of thing that I talk about. And then when I get into West Texas, South Texas, and especially in North Texas, when we start talking about environmental concerns, people that live in rural Texas may not consider themselves environmental conservationists by any stretch, but if you're a rancher or a farmer or a hunter, or you like fishing, you certainly like the environment to be clean enough to do that business and have your recreation. So
Absolutely.
you just talk about the stuff that affects people's lives.
Right on. Very good. Bill, are there any predictions that you might make about how this is going to go? Or I guess let me ask more specifically, what's kind of the worst case scenario here? Like spitball sort of question.
There's a few. First and foremost is New York doesn't find Maduro guilty, right? The assumption that he is criminally indicted and will have a due day in court and find out that, he's not guilty of the drug smuggling charges that he's been arraigned upon. There could be some real interesting scenarios where he goes back to Venezuela as legitimate president of Venezuela and says, you had no right to take over control of the country. We still don't have clarity of leadership in Venezuela as to the rest of the regime, the corruption of the top of the regime. Maduro may have been the figurehead, but the snake is quite long. And there is not a real clear understanding of military ops on the ground and who's managing the government and how's the snake functioning without the figurehead.
Right.
And I would suspect not much has changed. And again, we have a problem here with the Railroad Commission in that the Railroad Commission it should be prorating oil. Its original function and task was to help to manage production. And our current railroad commissioner's belief is basically open the taps and don't give the industry any restrictions or any kind of impediments to challenge their ability to produce. And so right now we are in a process of, if Venezuela were to suddenly start producing crude and suddenly flood the market, or Iran or anyone else, the Railroad Commission is not in any position to actually react. So the Railroad Commission itself is somewhat of it's a very, very important agency because it controls both the EPA and the state of Texas. Most Texans don't get this. There's a memorandum of understanding with the EPA that in Texas, the Railroad Commission reigns supreme on all choices and decisions for anything that has to do with anything in soil. Now, it doesn't include the groundwater table. It obviously doesn't have to do with air emissions, but the Railroad Commission actually has the ultimate authority in the state of Texas. And as John knows, as part of the Texas House Energy Commission, that the other agency, the Texas TCEQ, the problem there is that they get zero funding. So the only agency that's got money to enforce anything environmentally in the state of Texas is the Railroad Commission. And the Railroad Commission has no desire to change any status in the current state. The biggest issue we got here in the state is the earthquake problem that is being it's hard to hide 5.9 magnitude earthquakes. But there was one the other day here reported by a local rancher, almost 3 minutes long.
Wow.
2 minutes and 45 seconds long, shook her house. Now you got to understand, an earthquake that's 2.5 minutes long is a hell of a long earthquake.
Yes.
The magnitude and the severities of what's happening out here with the groundwater pollution, the zombie well phenomena, and the earthquakes are migrating east. And there are issues now in East Texas, upper Northeast Texas, from the additional disposal water coming over from Louisiana, because Texas has basically said, the Railroad Commission has said, we're welcome to business. Bring your produced water from New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Louisiana into Texas and dump it here, and we'll happily take the profit. And again, the Railroad Commission doesn't care. It's as simple as that. Ranchers and rural Texans, oh well, we're in Austin, and the industry here is here to make money and profit.
Right on. Well, this has been a great conversation. Every time we talk to you guys, we learn more. And so we really, really appreciate you joining us. There is one closing question that I wanted to ask, and this has to do with, I think, the source from which a great many Texans and a great many Americans these days are getting their information and their understanding about the Texas oil industry, and that is the TV show Landman. I'm curious, and I'm going to start with Jon because it's his turn. Exactly how full of shit is Landman?
That's so you're asking me this, and I've never watched it. I have no idea. But my everybody around me says it's a good show, and I should watch it. And the truth is, if for no other reason than for the purpose of this campaign, I should know, where it's bullshit and where it's not. I mean,
yes, you totally should.
And so I'm gonna punt this one to Bill because I'm not one of those politicians that blow smoke up people's asses. If I don't know the answer to the question, my answer is I don't know.
Well, I that's strike one. I hope Bill has been watching this show. Bill,
I have. I got first season down and some of the highlights of season 2. I got to say, it is full of shit. It's look, Taylor Sheridan did a fabulous job dramatizing the oil and gas industry and making bringing some Yellowstone drama to it. You know, it's filmed and shot outside of Fort Worth. I had a business partner come over from London. We went from San Angelo to Midland, and he said, "What the fuck is this? This looks like we're on the moon or Mars." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "This." He said, "This isn't like what it is in Landman." And I said, "That's correct." And after about 2 weeks of driving around and showing him around West Texas some of the highlights, he was like, "Yeah, no, like Landman series doesn't do any justice to any of this." And I said, "Exactly."
Right.
It's look, anything that brings attention to the industry and helps put it into the spotlight beyond people's understanding is good. The show's got some really funny lines and some great delivery by the characters, but the realities of on the ground business, yeah. Do we have cartels? Do we have theft? Yes. Do we have some of these issues that they have presented? Absolutely. And some of the backroom deals and the way things are done, is that actually how it occurs? Yes, to a degree. And I would argue that some of the stuff they do is pretty lame and tame because they really don't have real oil insiders actually telling them how bad the Jaguar strip club is in Odessa and how many credit cards are used by the corporate clients out here, right? The reality is that it's somewhat true in some degree, but of course it's a lot like the Deepwater Horizon horrific movie. That it's not a documentary, it's not a reality, it's a drama based on reality, and it's fiction. So Landman, hey, cheers to Taylor Sheridan and cheers to the film production, but yeah, no, it's not like the real world.
Well, one good thing about it is a lot more people know what the Railroad Commission is than did before. So just from the standpoint of having people curious and getting a little glimpse of something that existed no one even knew about before, that's good.
Indeed.
Now I'm going to have to watch it.
Yeah.
It's a bit rough. There's some parts in it that are a bit rough to watch, but yeah, it's certainly interesting. I had a laugh though, because one of the highlights I had of it was when I drove my business partner around. Our final stop before he flew out of Dallas is we were through the Dallas airport area.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "See the gas well over there and see the gas well over there and see the gas well over there." And he's like, "What the hell?" I said, "Yeah, 20 years ago when DFW wasn't in this location, they were still flying out of love." I said, "The reality was this was the Barnett Shale. These were the early wells of the Barnett Shale explosion that occurred that are uninsured, because again, anybody that has a blowout or has a major fire on one of those wells, you're shutting down DFW airport, and there is no insurance on those wells from the operators that operate those wells. Because again, it will be $1 billion a day of impact to an operator. There's not an insurance company that's going to write you a premium check for that. And people don't appreciate in Houston and Austin and San Antonio, and I would say this on the campaign trail, that like, look, how many wells are in this area? Well, there's 15,000 wells in Harris County. People don't think about that in Houston, Texas, that there is 15,000 oil and gas wells that have been drilled around the Houston, Texas area, let alone Dallas, let alone San Antonio. Bexar County's got like 8,000 active oil and gas wells. Like you don't think of it as oil and gas in your background, but the reality in the state of Texas, and what's important for people to realize, Landman brings it into perspective to some degree for some folks, that it's like, hey, we're really not that far away from oil and gas. There really is a drilling rig. Like, hey, we don't have to go that far to actually see something. It does exist.
Absolutely. And Jon, for your purposes on the campaign trail, you absolutely do need to watch this show. Just so you'll know the context for these kind of questions that are being thrown at you about it. I'm hopelessly addicted to this show in spite of the fact that it is clearly written from a MAGA perspective. It is absolutely shows you beyond the oil and gas thing, just into interpersonal relationships and basic sort of stuff. Very, very MAGA in terms of the way it portrays women, in terms of the way it portrays family relationships and different things. And so I've come to enjoy it in part because it provides for me a glimpse into the MAGA vision of the world so that I can kind of understand, how the opposition thinks and whatnot. And so that might be, broad brush for me necessarily, but yeah, Jon, watch the show for sure. Jon Rosenthal is our Democratic nominee for the Texas Railroad Commission. Way to go. And thanks for joining us, Jon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Absolutely. And Bill Burch, it's always a pleasure to see you. And we'll be touching base again, of course, as this Venezuela thing plays out, however that happens. Thanks for making time for us. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Always glad to be on. Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely. Progress Texas is an independent, nonprofit, rapid response media organization. While campaigns come and go, we're the permanent home for progressive media in action in the Lone Star State. Find out all about what we do at progresstexas.org. For Bill Burch and Jon Rosenthal, I'm Chris Mosier. We is out. Have a great rest of your day.